Have you ever wondered how close this continent came to being shaped by an indigenous confederacy, one vast and united enough to challenge the rising United States before it could swallow the land piece by piece? Imagine for a moment a coalition stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the forests of the Ohio Valley to the wide rivers of the Mississippi Basin. Not a loose collection of small tribes and scattered bands, but a united front of nations with shared purpose, shared vision, and shared resolve. This isn't just a legend or a romantic idea. It nearly happened. And at the center of this extraordinary movement were two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. One was a master strategist and orator who saw farther than most of his time. The other was a prophet whose spiritual fire lit the hearts of thousands. Together, they dreamed of stopping the relentless push of the United States westward, not through scattered resistance, but through unity and strategy. For a brief, electrifying moment, they almost did it. But their story is not just about resistance. It is about vision colliding with empire. It is about the fragile line between hope and betrayal. It is about how two brothers came closer than anyone to changing the destiny of a continent, and why their confederacy burned so brightly, then fell into ruin. How did they rise from a fractured world to lead a movement that terrified the young American Republic? How did they inspire so many nations to stand together? And how did their vision die, not in silence, but in fire and blood? This is the story of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, the brothers who tried to unite the continent. To understand the brothers, we must first return to the Ohio Valley in the mid to late 18th century, a landscape that was both ancient and unraveling. For thousands of years before European ships arrived, the valley was home to complex civilizations, the mound-building cultures, the Mississippian networks, and thriving Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and many other nations. But by the time Tecumseh was born in 1768, waves of European disease had already swept through, killing countless people before many settlers ever appeared. Empires collided here: the French, the British, the Spanish, and eventually the Americans, each carving up lands that were not theirs to give. The Shawnee were a people of movement and resilience. They had been displaced and scattered by earlier wars, only to return again and again to their homelands along the Ohio River. Tecumseh's father, Tecumseh, was a respected leader and warrior. He saw clearly that the colonists' hunger for land would not stop. When Tecumseh was just a boy, his father was killed in battle against encroaching settlers. That wound shaped him. He grew up surrounded by stories of lost land, broken promises, and a war that never truly ended. His younger brother, Lalawethika, born years later, entered a world scarred by uncertainty. While Tecumseh grew into a skilled hunter, warrior, and speaker, Lalawethika was awkward and often ridiculed. He struggled to find his place. Many thought he would amount to little. But this world, the one of constant displacement, treaty after treaty, the grinding push of settlers across rivers and forests, was also a world in which ordinary people could become extraordinary. Every log cabin that rose on indigenous land, every treaty signed under pressure, every raid, every skirmish built pressure like steam in a sealed vessel. And sooner or later, the vessel would burst. Lalawethika's transformation into Tenskwatawa is one of the most startling and profound moments in early American history. For most of his youth, he lived as a shadow beside Tecumseh, a man lost to despair, often drunk, without honor or accomplishment. But in 1805, something happened that changed him forever. One night, after collapsing into a deep state that many believed was death, he awoke with a vision. He claimed that he had journeyed into the spirit world, where the Creator spoke to him. The message was fierce, almost scathing. The Creator told him that the indigenous nations had lost their strength, not because of the white man's numbers or weapons, but because they had turned away from the sacred ways. They had allowed alcohol to poison their people. They had sold land that was never meant to be sold. They had forgotten the old ceremonies, the old stories, the balance that had sustained them for generations. Tenskwatawa returned from that vision transformed. His words were sharp and uncompromising. He began to preach that the nations must turn away from the settlers' ways, reject their alcohol, their goods, their religion, and their authority. They must return to the path of their ancestors and stand as one people. People listened. They were desperate for direction. Within months, word of the prophet spread far beyond Shawnee lands. Delegations from the Miami, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Delaware, and other nations traveled to hear him. They gathered around fires as he spoke of a future in which indigenous nations stood united under the Creator's law. At the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers, they built Prophetstown, a spiritual capital and rallying point for a movement unlike any the frontier had seen. To the United States, this was no longer just a Shawnee revival. It was a threat that would have to be crushed before it could grow too strong. While his brother spoke to the spirit, Tecumseh spoke to the nations. He saw the weakness of fragmented resistance. Tribe by tribe, village by village, the United States picked them off, making separate treaties, turning one against another. But Tecumseh understood something that few leaders did at the time. The settlers were not stopping. They would never stop. The Ohio River would not be the end of their frontier. It was merely the beginning. So Tecumseh began to travel. Across rivers, forests, plains, and mountains, he went from council to council, meeting chiefs and warriors, listening and persuading. His speeches became legend. In some accounts, he spoke for hours without pause, painting a vivid picture of the future that awaited if they did not unite. Their lands gone, their people scattered, their languages silenced. But if they joined together, if they set aside tribal rivalries and saw themselves as one people, they could hold the line. He secured alliances among the Great Lakes nations, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Ottawa. He reached to the west to the Kickapoo, Sauk, and Fox. He even traveled south to the Creeks, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, hoping to weave the northern and southern indigenous worlds into a single fabric of resistance. Prophetstown swelled with visitors, warriors, and supplies. It was no longer just a spiritual center. It was a political nerve center. To U.S. officials like Governor William Henry Harrison, this was terrifying. If Tecumseh succeeded, they would be facing a united indigenous front on a scale they had never encountered. In letters and reports, they described him not just as a warrior, but as a political genius and orator of rare power. Harrison knew that the longer Tecumseh's Confederacy grew, the harder it would be to destroy. And so, even as Tecumseh built alliances, a collision was coming. In 1811, Tecumseh traveled south again, seeking to convince the powerful Creek and Choctaw nations to join his Confederacy. It was during his absence that Harrison saw his chance. He assembled a force of over 1,000 men and marched toward Prophetstown. His goal was simple: break the Confederacy before it could truly unite. Tecumseh had given clear orders to his brother Tenskwatawa not to engage in open battle in his absence. But the prophet, under immense pressure, convinced that his spiritual power would shield their people, decided to act. In the early hours of November 7th, 1811, his warriors launched a surprise attack on Harrison's encamped army. What followed was chaos and fire. The indigenous warriors struck with speed and ferocity, but the Americans held their ground. Gunfire cracked through the night. Warriors fell, soldiers fell. By morning, Prophetstown was burning. Harrison declared victory, though the battle was bloody on both sides. But for Tenskwatawa and the movement, the blow was devastating. His spiritual authority, once so powerful, wavered. Doubt spread like smoke. When Tecumseh returned and saw the ashes of what had been the heart of his movement, his rage was volcanic, not only at Harrison, but at his brother for acting alone. Yet Tecumseh did not give up. He understood that the dream was wounded, not dead. And then history handed him a new dangerous opportunity, the War of 1812. When war erupted between the United States and Britain in 1812, Tecumseh saw the storm for what it was, a chance to strike back. By allying with the British, he could secure weapons, strategic support, and a fighting chance to reclaim indigenous lands. But Tecumseh did not enter the alliance as a servant. He entered as a leader. His warriors were essential to early British victories in the Northwest. His leadership during the capture of Detroit stunned the Americans. It wasn't just his strategy, it was his presence. He commanded respect. He demanded that the British honor their promises and support the creation of an indigenous territory. His vision remained the same, a sovereign indigenous confederacy. But the British, like so many powers before, saw indigenous nations as tools, not partners. As the war turned against them, they began to retreat, leaving Tecumseh and his warriors increasingly exposed. In October 1813, at the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh faced overwhelming American forces. The British abandoned the field. Tecumseh did not. He led his warriors in a last desperate stand. Surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, he fought to the end. He fell in battle, his body never officially identified. The Americans mutilated his remains, and in death, as in life, his image became a contested symbol. For the United States, his death marked the collapse of the Confederacy. For indigenous nations, it became legend. Tecumseh was not just a warrior. They remembered him as the last great hope of a united front. In the years after Tecumseh's death, the Confederacy unraveled. Tenskwatawa faded from power, eventually moving west with the Shawnee, a prophet without a flock. The Ohio Valley, the heartland of their people, was transformed into farmland, towns, and cities. But Tecumseh's vision did not die completely. It became a story, a song, a quiet fire passed down through generations. To many indigenous nations, Tecumseh became a symbol of what might have been. Even among American leaders, there was grudging respect. Generals spoke of his brilliance as a commander and his uncanny ability to unite people who had once fought one another. His legacy influenced later indigenous movements, the prophetic revivals that led to the ghost dance, the political unity of later tribal confederations, and the modern struggle for sovereignty and treaty rights. Tenskwatawa's spiritual fire, too, left its mark, inspiring religious movements long after Prophetstown burned. But perhaps the greatest echo of their story is the question it leaves behind. What if they had succeeded? What if Tecumseh's dream of an indigenous confederacy had held? How different would the map of North America be today? Their story is not a footnote. It is a turning point. It is a warning. And it is a reminder that even in the darkest moments of colonization, there were those who dreamed of unity, resistance, and freedom. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.